While the bad news of this euro crisis makes headlines in the U.S., what has not made headlines is the good news of a quiet revolution that has been taking place in Europe really for decades. Stephen Hill joins me today to talk about the crisis, but in the context of his new book, Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope for an Insecure Age. Let me just start off with a few things you may not have heard about. The European Union, 27 nations with 500 million people, has become the largest, wealthiest trading bloc in the world, producing nearly a third of the world's economy, nearly as large as the U.S. and China combined. Europe has more Fortune 500 companies than either the U.S., China, or Japan. European nations are rated by the World Health Organization as having the best healthcare systems in the world, yet they spend far less than the United States for universal coverage, even as U.S. healthcare is ranked 37th. Europe leads in confronting global climate change with renewable energy technologies like solar and wind power, conservation, green design, creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the process. Consequently, and this is an amazing statistic, Europe's ecological footprint, that is the amount of the Earth's capacity that a population consumes, is half of the United States for the same standard of living. In other words, each American uses twice the resources that a European uses to have the same quality of life. Stephen Hill is director of the Political Reform Program for the New America Foundation and author of 10 Steps to Repair American Democracy and Fixing Elections, The Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics. And his newest book, the one we're talking about today, is Europe's Promise. Welcome, Stephen Hill.
Thank you, Terrence. It's my great pleasure.
Okay. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So it's interesting. Your role at New America is in political reform, and yet the book we're talking about is about Europe. How do they fit together in terms of your personal path?
I first began traveling to Europe in the late 1990s, specifically to study their political institutions and their democracies, and they actually have quite a different set of institutions than we have here. So they have things like full public financing of campaigns and free media time for candidates, universal voter registration. Everyone gets registered to vote, not the business, the monkey business we have around our elections where, I try to get my people registered and keep your people off. And then they have proportional representation, which creates multi-party democracy. So that was really my initial interest, my initial fascination. And in the process of doing dozens of interviews and, including with elected leaders, but also people in the street sort of interviews, I began to become aware of that so much else about Europe was not only much different than here in the United States in things like healthcare and energy and transportation, even the way, essentially Europe has redesigned corporations, and yet we don't hear about that in the United States. And so increasingly I began to think, there's actually a book here to talk about this European way, as I've coined it, that the way that they design their economy and how that's related to their energy and transportation regime and how that's related to the fact that they do have a much more pluralistic political democracy than we have in the United States. And all these things are quite connected, and that in sum, the European way really addresses much better, the two challenges that we have, I believe, in the world in the 21st century, which is how are we going to identify the institutions and practices that allow a global population of 6.5 billion people to enjoy a decent standard of living, or another way of saying that is how are we going to allow the Chinas and the Indias and the Brazils to come up in the world and without the wealthy countries that we have been suffering a drastic drop in our standard of living, and do all that in a way that's as environmentally sustainable as possible. These two great challenges that face us, Europe has come up with some real innovations that we here in the United States should look more closely at.
Very good. And let me just say, in response to one of the very first things you said, which is that you went to Europe to study their political systems. And one of the things that I often find myself saying on the show is that while we may be the longest and earliest democracy, no one else has followed us exactly. In other words, it's an odd thing. I think Americans who are so into novelty and change yet somehow assume that their system is still the best, even though it's the earliest.
That's exactly right. And in many ways, other nations, they're not so quite inside the box. And so they look at what we do here in the United States, or, for example, our lack of public financing of campaigns. And they just shake their heads and see the obvious downsides to that. And they design things quite differently. So public financing of campaigns, and they believe that even the minor parties should have that public financing because They want to foster a robust public debate of ideas around election time. And you don't have the dumbed-down, Tweedledum, Tweedledee, sort of if I'm right, you're wrong type of political debate you have here in the United States. You have much more of a nuanced debate where different points of view get out there, and they can argue for their point of view and try to win as many votes. And then because they have proportional representation, if you're like a Green Party, for example, winning only 5% of the popular vote, you can actually win 5% of the seats in the legislature. Instead of here, 5% in the United States wins you nothing. In Europe, it actually can win you that percentage of the seats that you get that matches your percent of the votes. And we just saw an election in the UK where you had a third party, the Liberal Democrats, that won about 25% of the vote, yet only ended up with 9% of the seats. And instead, the Labour and Conservative parties, the bigger parties, won a much higher share of the seats than they did of the votes. These sorts of distortions happen a lot in our winner-take-all system, which is what Britain has as well, where you're electing one single seat at a time. And so really, in many ways, the rest of the world looks at these very old practices, and we've been using these methods since the 18th century, and they say, you know what, there are more modern ways to give representation to the pluralistic societies that we have become, and those are the ways that they gravitate to.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. Steve, I want to deal with the good news and the bad news, so let's try to get the current crisis in Europe out of the way first, and then we can devote the rest of the hour to the broader context of the good news. It seems to me that Europe, and especially the UK, suffered a meltdown about the same time we did here in the U.S. back in the fall of '08, and they seemed to be gradually recovering, and recovering with less pain because of their healthier safety net to their citizens when this new crisis hit. What is it that happened? What caused the current crisis in Europe?
Well, it's simply the case that the world suffered an economic earthquake of about 8.0 on the Richter scale a year and a half, 2 years ago, and we've seen a number of aftershocks since, and we're going to continue to see them in different parts of the world. We've seen ones in Greece, for example, but we've seen them here in California, too, and we're about to go through another budget process in California in which we may end up, like last year, issuing IOUs to prevent from defaulting. We've already seen the types of layoffs that's going on in California. A new report recently showing 25% of Californians do not have health insurance. Well, at least in Greece, while they're going through their economic crisis, everyone has health insurance. They have access to the safety, the social supports that families and individuals have in European countries in general. But the things here's a few things that, as I look at this situation, that jump out to me. One, while we think of Europe as very old, in fact, the European Union only dates to 2004. That's when the current configuration of 27 nations and 500 million people came to its current size. The euro only dates to 2002. So in many ways, the European Union is quite young. Mm-hmm. And at its core, when it was conceived, everybody knew that the monetary union, which 17 nations in the European Union use, did not include a fiscal union. So you would share the same currency, but you would not be able to really look over each other's books, and you wouldn't require balanced budgets like we have here in the United States. The states have to have balanced budgets. And if one nation got in trouble, there was no means for what's known as a financial backstop, where other nations or even a federal government could help bail out that member state in trouble. Though it's interesting to look at that last year when California was in trouble, they actually came to the federal government and asked for help, and the Obama administration turned them down. Compare that to what's going on in Europe right now, where Germany and France and the other Euro nations have now agreed to put money up to help Greece out. So you have a situation where even though we have the financial backstop capability in the United States, the federal government is refusing to do that for California, which is 14% of the nation's economy, really too big to fail. Whereas Greece, which is only 2% of Europe's economy, is now getting that financial backstop from Germany and France and other countries. I mean, this is a historic moment, and many people aren't seeing it that way. Instead, you're seeing all the gloom and doom scenarios out there. But having France and Germany and other countries saying we're going to financial backstop Greece and potentially Portugal and Spain if they need it, in a sense, creating what has been called a European Monetary Fund. It's a big step in the terms of the formation of this European Union.
Yeah, let me cut in for a second, Steve. So just so people realize the import of that. In other words, as you say, when they set up their financial relationship, they didn't set up all these rules, all these possibilities, and so on, and yet they have freelanced in a way in the face of the crisis, and freelanced toward solidarity and freelanced toward actually imposing the richest nations imposing on themselves obligations which they hadn't even agreed to.
That's exactly right, and the other thing to keep in mind is that if you look at our own nation's formation, our first government was in 1789. It took about 80 years after that before we really ceased being just a collection of regions and really became a nation. And in fact, it took a civil war to resolve two of the contradictions built into our nation's foundation, which was slavery and states' rights versus national rights, federalism. And during that 80 years, there were at least 7, by my count, bank and financial panics that plagued the nation. So, looking at it from that point of view, it's not surprising that Europe is now having to deal with one of the contradictions that was built into the formation of the euro, which was this lack of financial backstop. But what I see is that Europe frequently evolves in reactions to a crisis, and they are evolving now in reaction to this crisis. So they've set up the basics of a European Monetary Fund. They also now are giving Eurostat, which is the data collection agency of Europe, more power to look over the books of the member states. Where 3 years ago, when there was a proposal to do that, it was rejected as an infringement on sovereignty. Now they're saying we have to do this. They're also cracking down on derivatives, credit default swaps, and hedge funds in a way that Timothy Geithner and the Obama administration has not been willing to do. They are moving forward with financial regulation that is much more ambitious and progressive than the recent bills that have been passed through the Senate and the House here in the United States. In addition, the European Central Bank was set up originally to only be basically a traffic cop to monitor inflation. It never was intended to have the mission as broad as the Federal Reserve Bank has here in the United States, and now we see the ECB actually taking on more responsibilities to basically guarantee the solvency of the Eurozone and to not just focus on inflation. So these are everyone's got their crystal ball out with their own facts and figures, and what I see is that no one really knows quite what's going on, but I think these trends are actually fairly positive, and I wrote a piece for Forbes.com saying, in 5 years we may look back on this and say, this was an episode that actually caused the European Union to become more united.
I know. It's interesting. I think what you see is that people who have whatever axe to grind, in other words, those people who love to denigrate Europe as softer and weaker, or there's a whole group of people that have a constant litany of what's wrong with Europe, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And so
there's no question this is being used in an ideological way. You see, first you see Fox News and the far right, of course, saying, this is what happens. The United States is going to end up like Greece if we don't deal with our deficits. And Obama, look what he's doing. And they're doing this in, trying to get it ready for the November elections. But even beyond Fox News, you see certain free trade or free enterprise sort of Democrats using this as an example to say we've got to cut our deficits, we've got to cut Social Security, we've got to cut Medicare. And so you see the ideological forces using this as their excuse to basically try to mold the United States back into the same themes and trends and regulatory regimes that got us into this mess to begin with. Stephen
Hill, author of Europe's Promise, I'm going to actually throw at you a couple of different folks who've commented on the crisis. First, from Europe, and I'm sure you've probably seen this, Gabor Steingart, editor-in-chief of the German financial newspaper Handelsblatt, basically says what you say. And just so people know, this is a financial newspaper. This is not a liberal rag. And he basically says, like you, and what I was pointing out was that those who want to say Europe want to see Europe fail, say, oh, this crisis is going to bring them down, whereas, in fact, what you say and what Steingart says is, here's a quote from Steingart. The significance of the events that are unfolding now will become clear to us only with time. The press calls it a fatal crisis, but the headline should really be a birth announcement. All we can do now is hold our breath and hope that the baby will survive. And what he says is the same thing you did, that when faced with the crisis, nations extended their obligations, extended their mutual responsibilities. And he says, having forced itself into an era of continental policymaking, Europe must now play catch-up with its democratic system. Millions of Europeans already feel alienated by Brussels. If the achievements of this crisis are to survive, and notice that the achievements of the crisis, as you say, European leaders must figure out how to make sure that people are heard in the political process. Europe as a decision-making body is a fact. Now it has to become more democratic. Your thoughts on that?
I think he's absolutely right. And again, Europe is a new entity. The European Union is new, so all these things are evolving. In fact, the European Union has just created a continental-wide initiative process where a million Europeans putting their signature to a ballot measure can actually propose a law now to the European Commission, which is the chief executive body of Europe. And so here you have Europe creating a continent-wide initiative process that we don't have here in the United States. And part of it is as they grope towards becoming more democratic, more transparent, and improving the relations between the nation states and the European Union continental-wide government. So, I still think that, here's a few other things that I'm paying attention to during this. One is the role of the so-called economic experts. The economic experts missed an $8 trillion housing bubble. Okay, let's start there. But you also can, I have some parts in my book where I go back through the history of the economic experts as well as the American media reporting on Europe. In the early 1990s, remember, they said that Japan was going to eat America's lunch and that we were going to have budget deficits as far as the eye can see. In fact, the concern over budget deficits in the early 90s gave Ross Perot his political career.
That's right.
And yet by the end of the 1990s, Japan was in the economic doldrums and we had a budget surplus. At the same time, they were saying Germany was going down. There was one headline saying Germany is slumped on the razor's edge. They were going to be gripped by massive unemployment. The quality of life was going to decline. By the end of the 1990s, Germany was the largest exporter in the world. They had increased the amount of supports for families and individuals, and in fact, they had reduced the work week because they were able to do so. They said the euro initially was going to fall flat on its back, and within a year, the euro was strong as the United States. Then you flash forward to this decade, from 2003 to 2006. I have a number of headlines in my book from American media, basically all saying Europe, with its weak, sclerotic economy, was going to be a dying place. And yet, it turned out in 2003 to 2006, the European economy was in the process of surpassing the American economy in the fast lane in terms of increase in the creation of jobs, productivity. In fact, there was an article in October 2006 in Newsweek International. The cover of the magazine said, "Europe, the great jobs machine." That story never appeared in Newsweek. And so, these economic experts, as far as I can tell, are wrong more than they're right. And then look at the rating agencies. Oh. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch's. They were giving AAA ratings to derivatives created by Goldman Sachs and others that they knew were designed to fail. Well, these are the same rating agencies now that are downgrading Greece, Portugal, Spain.
And California.
There's something that just fundamentally doesn't add up here. I mean, how many economists have lost their jobs over being so wrong so many times, particularly most recently with missing an $8 trillion housing bubble?
Believe me, in America, it seems that if you are mainstream or slightly to the right of mainstream on economics or on military issues, it doesn't matter how wrong you are, you remain an expert. What I wanted to do was an article that I grabbed from May 23rd from the New York Times. Again, not exactly in this case, remember I read from a financial journalist in Europe, now from what is considered by Fox News at least to be a liberal organ in the U.S. Stephen Erlanger writes an article, New York Times, the 23rd of May. Europeans fear crisis threatens liberal benefits. Right? I'm sure you saw this one, and I want you to counter it, but he says, among other things, with low growth, low birth rates, longer life expectancies, Europe can no longer afford its comfortable lifestyle, at least not without a period of austerity and significant changes. And he states that as fact. That's his lead line. Changes have now become urgent. Europe's population is aging quickly as birth rates decline. Unemployment has risen as traditional industries have shifted to Asia. The region lacks competitiveness in world markets. By 2050, the percentage of Europeans older than 65 will nearly double, et cetera. Figures show the severity of the problem, gross public social expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge is particularly daunting in France, which has done less to reduce the state's obligations than some of its neighbors. In Sweden and Switzerland, 7 of 10 people work past 50. In France, only half do, et cetera, et cetera. This is 4 days ago in the New York Times. Your response?
Well, these are the exact same things they said in the 1990s and they said in the early part of the 2000s. So it's just sort of like, deja vu all over again. There's another crisis, and so now they're using this again as the reason to bash what they call the welfare state. But in my book, I call it the workfare support system, because it's really about providing the supports for families and individuals so that they can remain healthy and productive and make them good workers. That's what the European system is about. It's predictable. That's all I can say.
Yep.
I mean, as I say in my book, I have all these articles that I went back through the 1990s and early part of this decade, in which they're saying the exact same things then, and they turned out to be completely the exact opposite. In fact, Europe was passing us both in the 1990s and in the 2000s.
Right, and when he makes statements like unemployment has risen as traditional industries have shifted to Asia and the region lacks competitive world markets, the statistics that you've just quoted about competitiveness, about exports, about employment, all counteract that, and he states it as fact just because it seems to me he's been stating it as fact for 20 years.
Exactly, and they just wait for their moment to go back to the same old script. In fact, I had a debate a few months ago with someone from the Hudson Institute, which is a neoconservative think tank. And I'll tell you, not only in terms of Europe, but just in terms of what the United States should do, their talking points haven't changed since 5-6 years ago. The same formulas, the same prescriptions that got us into this mess, they're ready to take us back to the same sorts of policies. And to them, this economic collapse was just, sometimes that happens in capitalism every now and then, but we pick up the pieces and we move on. And that's their response to, how you should design a modern nation in order to take care of your people, is that we shouldn't do anything different. What we've been doing is fundamentally right. It's just that, it kind of broke for a while there, but we'll get back on track. And I just completely disagree, and I really think that Europe is onto something about, the way, for example, they've created more economic democracy in Europe.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little more. Let me just read a couple of other things. These are quotes from you that I'm sure would be news to most people, that Europe is the largest trading partner of both the United States and China, and they have more, I think relatively, and I'm not quoting this, but this is what I gathered from reading, they have relatively more manufacturing to service sector than we do. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
There was a famous interview between former Prime Minister Tony Blair when he was interviewing Chancellor Angela Merkel from Germany. He said, how do you do it in Germany? You're not that large of a country, yet you're the world's largest exporter. How do you do it? And she turned to him and said, we still make things, Mr. Blair.
Exactly. And as you point out, it is not merely Siemens and Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen, that Europe actually has more numerous small businesses that provide 2/3 of the jobs in Europe compared to about only half supplied by small businesses in America.
That's right. Across Germany, Italy, France, you have all these small and medium-sized businesses. Some of them are family-owned, have been family-owned for decades. In fact, part of Germany's exporting sector are these family-owned, small and medium-sized manufacturers that are manufacturing really high-end manufacturing products that are needed in the production stages for assembly line work, for example. And they are the best in the world at producing a particular small part that is needed, but they are able to do it with such precision and such efficiency that everybody in the world wants their product. And
you can't
exporting to China and
right.
India and the emerging markets, as they're called. That's where they export to.
You can't lowball them because of their quality.
That's right.
Yeah.
They do things in a way that makes their products in demand around the world because they focus on quality and not so much on mass production.
Now we're going to talk more about, so we've been talking about what is the reality, what's happening in the crisis, what are the distinctions and so on. Now we're going to, for the second half we will bury deeper into how, and then we'll talk about how can we possibly remain so blind when there's a how going on across the ocean. But let me read a quote of yours, and then I'll ask you a question. Quote, more than any other place, Europe is the leader in figuring out how to harness the dynamic wealth-creating engine of capitalism so that its prosperity is both ecologically sustainable and broadly shared, including far superior supports for families and individuals to help them stay healthy and productive during a time of rising inequality. Now, this harnessing of capitalism is attacked from the right as socialism and by the far left as naive and ultimately undoable. Right? You can't fix capitalism. It's evil. Does what's emerging in Europe, despite the fact that we don't seem to notice it, is what's emerging in Europe argue by example, by the fact that it's happening, the fact that something workable might be possible?
Yes, that's one of the points of my book is that, as I began studying it more deeply, I came to the conclusion that, one, Europe is not socialist at all. As you said earlier, more Fortune 500 companies, the United States and China combined, largest economy, producing nearly a third of the world's GDP. This is not socialism in any sense. It's capitalism, but it's what I call in the book social capitalism, and I compare that to what we have in the United States, which I call Wall Street capitalism. And social capitalism has figured out how to harness the ability of capitalism to create wealth. Because, even I think someone on the left would have to acknowledge that capitalism is the greatest wealth generator that humans have ever devised. But there's an outstanding question there. Who gets that wealth? Whose pockets does it flow into? And that's where Europe has taken a dramatically different tack than we in the United States by creating this more broadly shared prosperity. And they do that by putting it into things like health care, more generous retirement pensions, paid sick leave, paid parental leave after you have a child, more generous vacations, low cost, in some cases in European countries, university education that is still free, child care so that working families have support is in some countries it's free, in other countries it's about 1/6 of what Americans pay for child care. All these things are what I call the workfare support system that supports families and individuals to make sure that they can be healthy and productive and good workers. And that's really the European way, as I describe it in the book, and I think it's powerful. Okay. We here in the United States really need to take a closer look at that, whether you're on the left or the right.
Right. Closer look. We need to know that it exists. One of the other points you make, Steve, is that, and I'm going to read a quote of yours again, because this is just astounding, really. Europe has managed to lead the world when it comes to reducing its ecological footprint, half the ecological footprint of the U.S. for the same standard of living. And the EU is also now the largest, wealthiest trading bloc, producing nearly a third of the global economy, nearly as large as the U.S. and China. How do they do that, and why does it seem to us so difficult?
Well, there's a few things, and it's interesting to know as a side note that instead what you're hearing is a bunch of G2 hype about China is going to be the superpower of the future, the United States is the current superpower, and yet when we look at the two challenges that we face about how we're going to allow 6.5 billion people to have a decent standard of living and do that in a way that's as environmentally sustainable as possible so we don't all burn up in a Venus atmosphere of our own creation, Europe is clearly the place that is leading the way and figuring out the innovations that we need, and yet you hear so little about it, which is really quite amazing to see the media once again, just as they missed an $8 trillion housing bubble, they missed weapons of mass destruction. They are really missing the importance of what's going on in Europe. Now, so in terms of how they have managed to harness capitalism to create this social capitalism, I have a lot of information in the book about that, but there's a couple that I think we should talk about. One is what they call co-determination, and I'll talk about Germany because they were the ones that pioneered this, and now it is spread throughout Europe.
Let me grab this from you and throw it back to you because that's exactly where I was going. I'll just throw you three questions, and they're going to lead you right into this. What do you mean by workfare, which I think is a great way of defining what you're talking about, rather than this notion of evil welfare? And then the relationships of workers to management and boards of directors, co-determination, supervisory boards, work councils, those sorts of things. That's exciting stuff.
It really is. I had an article about this in The Nation magazine a couple of weeks ago. And, I mean, the workfare system is simply, it's about, as I said, how do you design a system that gives families and individuals the support they need in order to be good workers in an increasingly economically insecure age. where you have to compete against workers in India and China, and how do you produce enough wealth with your economy and learn to do more with less? I mean, the wealthy countries like the United States and those in Europe and Japan are going to have to learn to do more with less. And it's, in other words, the amount of wealth that your economy produces, you're going to have to take care of your people with that, because it's not likely that we're going to be the big economic dominant power that we were in the post-World War II period. We're in the era of G20, of multilateralism, of a globalized world, and these other countries are coming up in the world. So all of the wealthy countries are going to be charged with doing more with less, whether it's with your economy and being able to take care of your people with the amount of wealth produced by your economy, as well as with energy and being able to increase what's called energy productivity. You're going to have to get more energy out of the same amount of fuel that you used yesterday. You have to get more energy out of it than we did before, and by using more renewables.
Right, and if I could quickly say, it seems to me the biggest thing is in terms of international equity. That says this, and then in terms of the environment, climate change, peak oil, etc., says the same thing. They both give the same directive.
Exactly, and so that's the charge that every advanced society, advanced economy has to deal with. And so Europe has come up with these institutions that is helping them to do that. And one of them is, as I mentioned earlier, co-determination, and that simply means, in Germany, for example, they have big corporations like we have Fortune 500 companies with names that people have heard of, like Daimler and Volkswagen and Mercedes and Deutsche Telekom, and they have a board of directors like our corporations have a board of directors. But in Germany, the workers are allowed to elect 50% of the members of that board of directors of those major corporations. I've been giving talks all around the United States, and I always ask, how many Americans have heard that a major economy like Germany, the fourth largest economy in the world's first or second largest exporter, depending on what numbers you use, here they allow their workers to elect 50% of the board members of Fortune 500 companies. It would be as if, imagine if we had a law requiring Walmart to have its workers elect 50% of its board members. Imagine the impact that would have on employees, as well as how it treats its supply chain. And if other corporations like Google and Apple, if all of them also required their workers, were required to allow their workers to elect 50% of their board members. That's essentially what Germany has done. In Sweden, 1/3 of the board members are elected by the workers. Other nations have different percentages. In essence, they have reinvented the corporation.
Right. In other words, one of the things you point out is that when we have, again, progressives and folks on the left rail against the corporation and, remove their charter if they're evil, again, as I said about capitalism could not work. The corporation is inherently wrong because it has no soul, and this whole question about, personhood for corporations. What you're saying is that while we don't have to go all the way to personhood, that's another question, but that actually persons have an influence in corporations here. They have reinvented and redefined the corporation in a way that perhaps it might work.
Exactly, and as you can imagine, there's all sorts of studies in Europe about what is the impact of having worker-elected boards of directors for corporations, and the studies show quite clearly that it creates a much more of what is called a culture of consultation,
right,
where the employers and the employees are much more have their fingers in each other's pie and have to figure out the direction of that corporation together. It doesn't mean that the employees run the corporation. It doesn't mean that the employers can steamroll over their employees. It means that they have to have a degree of input and discussion about what that business is going to do in a way that American workers could scarcely conceive of.
Let me ask you a question on that, and this is Stephen Hill, and we're talking about his book, Europe's Promise. Wouldn't that idea of workers electing members to the board of directors be a worthy target of U.S. workers in negotiations, in labor negotiations? In other words, very often lately they've been asked to give up things, some of pension things that they'd won before. Are there any unions in America that are making this a demand? Is there any movement within the labor movement in the U.S. to ask for a voice in selecting the board?
There has been recently, not exactly in the way that we're talking about with co-determination, but actually the United Mine Workers have embarked on a partnership with the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain to create mining companies that are cooperatives between the workers and the worker-owned cooperatives, basically. And so there is more discussion now about how do we allow, I mean, if workers have to give back, if there have to be cutbacks, then shouldn't the price be more worker either control or input or say or consultation?
Absolutely. I mean, it seems to me it's like okay, you want to take something hard, give me something soft.
Exactly. I mean, it seems like they have to, in some ways, figure out a way. And the studies show that, for example, they did one study of business managers in Sweden, and they were asked, would you like to get rid of this co-determination? And they said, it's a pain, no question, because it means you're inevitably locked into interminable discussions with your employees on different things. But by and large, I think it works because it allows me, for one, to have more communication and coordination with my employees so that they understand the direction I want to go and I understand what their needs are and the impacts that any change in direction will have on them. And it also reduces tension between management and labor in a way that allows us to not have disruptions, and which is becomes really difficult when you're competing in a global economy.
And let me just tell people, by the way, that was 2/3 of executives in this study viewed it as very or rather positive, and 8 of 10 chairmen were satisfied and felt it was not important to reduce worker representation.
Exactly, and in the meantime, Swedish workers are some of the most highly compensated in terms of both income and the supports they have, health care, generous retirement pensions, child care, all the things that Americans and progressives in the United States are trying to get. They've already got them in Sweden and in Germany and other places, even though they have capitalism, even though they have Fortune 500 companies, because they have created a set of laws, regulations, institutions that allow them to harness this capitalist engine to produce a more broadly shared prosperity. And the other interesting thing about it in terms of co-determination is that, it was first put into place in Germany after World War II, and it was very much supported by the American conquering powers.
Exactly.
Because we were looking for a way to break up and decentralize the power of the German industrialists who had supported the Nazis. And so we were very encouraging of this line of thinking that came from some German economists, one by the name of Ludwig Erhard, who later became Chancellor of Germany, because it fit what we wanted. I mean, we understood the power of institutions to accomplish certain goals. In fact, I say in the book, we punished Germany by giving them economic democracy, which we haven't seen to give fit to our own workers today.
I know, and I wonder whether, if one looked back at some of the, those U.S. planners, a lot of them, this came out, some of it came out of the military and so on, whether some of Eisenhower's warnings, didn't somehow see the same sorts of things, in terms of some of his warnings about military-industrial complex and so on. But yeah, our punishment for them has actually, it took them a while, but they now, as you say, are a more successful manufacturing economy than we are, and do it with an entirely different set of human software. One other thing you pointed out was that Germany has handled unemployment during this economic crisis differently.
That's right. I mean, in the United States, our unemployment has more than doubled. We're about at 9.9% of officially unemployed, but even higher amount of unofficially unemployed. And in Germany, the unemployment rate has barely gone up because instead of laying off millions of workers like we did here in the United States, they pursued a policy of what is called short work, or Kurzarbeit in German. They had everyone cut back a little bit of their time. So instead of going for 100%, instead of working 100%, they cut back to, say, 90%. But during the good years, they were laying aside money, so that if you went from 100% to 90%, you're still getting, approximately 95% of your wages. And by doing that, some other good things happen. One, you have more people with money in their pockets, because what happens in an economic downturn like this is that consumers quit spending. So then businesses cut back because they have fewer customers and they have to lay off more people, and you get into a downward cycle. By doing short work, it intervenes on the depth of that downward cycle. The second thing it does is it keeps your workforce intact, so when the recovery comes, you're ready to go. And then the third thing it does is that it prevents the utter devastation that happens to communities and to families when their breadwinner gets laid off. In Stockton, California, 25-30% of homes are in foreclosure, entire neighborhoods boarded up, and you're seeing increase in domestic violence and in alcoholism, mental illness because of breadwinners and the getting laid off and the devastation that it creates. And yet with Larry Summers, who is one of Barack Obama's closest economic advisors, was asked, look, why don't we try this German thing, this short work? It seems to be working pretty well. His response was, well, here in the United States, we're not about protecting old jobs. We're about creating new jobs, as if there's a conflict between the two. And I think it really just shows how we're just so locked into a fundamentalist view of free enterprise, even though if you accurately describe our free enterprise system, it's one where we've privatized the gains and socialized the losses. And yet in Germany, they're much more pragmatic about their capitalism. You know, we want to use capitalism but not have it use us. And we want to make sure the wealth is created is spread around for people and that everybody benefits from it.
Right. And the other thing is that what we're running into in this country now is that people are not just out of work, but they're out of work for 6 months, 9 months, a year. And when that happens, all sorts of feedback loops kick in where it becomes harder and harder to get a job, to be trained for the next job, and so on. Whereas if you keep people, this derisive, arrogant tone about old jobs, believe me, people would like to be able to have an old job. And when you keep them on the force and you have a vibrant corporation, you can then bring them into new jobs rather than having people start from zero. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Stephen Hill. He's the director of the Political Reform Program at the New America Foundation. And we're talking about his book, Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope for an Insecure Age. You can learn more at europespromise.org. When you talk about America, and we don't have, I'll throw out a few statistics just to have it happen quickly. 14% of Americans live in poverty.
It's about 42 million people.
Right. That's compared to 6% in France, 8% in Britain, 5% or less in Germany, Sweden, and Belgium. 20% of American children live below the poverty line. 23% of the elderly. And when you think about that, 1 out of 5 children and 1 out of 5 elderly live in poverty. This is the highest figure in any industrialized country with the exception of Russia and Mexico. And finally, the wealthiest 10% of Americans own 70% of the wealth. In Germany, the top 10% own 44%. You say, in America, the drawbridge has been pulled up. That's a very powerful image. What's the picture you see?
Just as you say. In fact, there's a recent book out, another research called The Spirit Level.
I was going to ask you about that. I've had them on the show.
And they show that the amount of inequality in your society is connected to other social ills like crime and the incarceration rate. We incarcerate 10 times as many people in the United States compared to Europe. And incidentally, people in institutions like jails are not included in your unemployment rate, so it has the impact of actually artificially lowering our unemployment rate by about 1.4% compared to Europe because we don't count people in jail and we incarcerate so many more people.
Let me just say something, Steve. You're for some reason your phone connection broke up just as you were mentioning the name of that book. The book is The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, and what they do is they take 30 years of research, and I highly recommend the book. I highly recommend the podcast. You can find on the website terrencemcnally.net. What they did was they took 30 years of research, and they found that how equitable a country is in the distribution of wealth. And you pointed out just a couple of things, but it is on almost every dimension. Health, education, innovation even. I mean, America would claim, we're more innovative because we're tougher and leaner. No. Even in innovation, number of patents and things like that, everything seems to conform. And as they point out, if you could make the changes upstream that would change equity in your country, then you are likely, at least based on this research, to change everything in your country.
Right, and you see the same results, for example, looking at health indicators, and that's certainly related to our healthcare system. And Europe has a very different approach to how they do healthcare systems. Unfortunately, the debate on healthcare in the United States has sort of boiled down to either single payer or what's derogatorily called socialized medicine, or to what we have now, the for-profit system. But actually, France and Germany, Switzerland, Belgium actually have a system that's not either
that's right.
Socialized medicine, as it's called, single payer, or what we have. They've come up with a third way that, again, in the United States, Americans are not hearing about. And for example, using Germany as the example, the backbone of Germany's healthcare system is 200 private insurance companies, private health insurance companies, just as we have in the United States. But here's the key difference. In Germany, they're all nonprofit.
Exactly.
Here in the United States, they're all for-profits. A for-profit health insurance company has two incentives. One, to jack your rates up as high as they can possibly get away with, hence Anthem Blue Cross announcing an increase of up to 40% in individuals' premiums. And secondly, to give you as few services as possible, because every time they give you a service, that's money out of their pocket. That's the incentives of a for-profit healthcare system. But when you have a nonprofit healthcare system, they don't have longer waits. In fact, Germany has shorter waits than we have. You have freedom to go to any doctors you want, and the costs are much cheaper. We're spending on average twice as much money per capita on healthcare as a country like Germany, and getting far worse results. The other thing that Germany does, besides having nonprofit health insurance companies, is because you don't have the incentives of making money and CEOs making $150 million in salaries. They can have other features. For example, every year or two, the stakeholders in the system, so the healthcare professionals like doctors and nurses, but also the consumer representatives and the insurance companies, they get together and they negotiate all the fees that are going to be charged for every service that's done, kind of like what we do in Medicare, and that helps to keep your costs down. It also, if you go into a French doctor's office, for example, they can give you a menu, in a sense, of everything they do in that office and how much they charge for it. That's called transparency. Try looking at your own health insurance bill and figuring out, what they're billing you for, what the service was. They maybe will put a code on there and you don't even know what the code is. There's no transparency at all. So because they have a nonprofit system, they can negotiate costs and fees, keep the costs down, and they can have things like transparency built into their system. So
very good. Let me tell people, again, I'm speaking with Stephen Hill. We're talking about his book, Europe's Promise. There's a website, europespromise.org. I don't know if I'm going to have time. I'm going to leave it for the end to talk about Europe's relationship to Obama, because I want to ask a couple of big questions right now. One, you say American progressives, while searching for effective responses to globalization, appear to be mostly unaware of these intriguing European inventions. And this is a point that I think we've made over and over again in the course of this interview, that there is something out there that is working for quality of life. It's working for environmental sustainability. It's sharing the wealth. And yet, as you point out, and as one knows, we don't make constant reference to this. Now, this sounds to me almost pathological, that the people of America who pride themselves on being the biggest, baddest can-do culture ever have actually been so blinded by something. And I want you to talk to me what you think that might be. I'm not sure quite what it is. That most of them are not aware of what we're talking about. And I just throw this out. This just occurred to me as I was preparing for this interview. At one time, most Europeans thought the populated world ended at their coastlines, until a few courageous explorers went beyond that limit. Well, now it looks to me like the U.S. suffers from a culture that believes the world ends at its coastlines, and so it can't even see what's working across the ocean so that we could adapt, improve, and recreate the best of what works. What to you explains what I think is a pathological, because it is so self-destructive, lack of our ability to see beyond our borders?
Well, it comes down to the media and, especially the corporate media and its failure to really report. I mean, without outlets like KPFK, Americans would know even less than they do. And it also comes down to the power of ideology. And we've had, ever since Ronald Reagan stood up at his first inaugural address saying government is the problem, we've had 40 years of bashing where, the right wing and the conservatives, Republican Party, saying that government is the problem, government can't do anything, it's a bumbler, we've got to get government out of the way, we've got to deregulate, and that's been a very powerful ideology. And then when Bill Clinton in 1996, in order to win re-election, got up there and said the era of big government is over, basically the Democrats gave up that argument, and not that anyone wants big government, but you could have made an argument in favor of smart government, which is what I say Europe has. They don't have big government, they have smart government.
Yeah, because a lot of the things you're talking about are not government-driven. The corporations themselves have seen that this is a wiser, a sounder, a more effective way to deal with things.
Exactly, and as I said, Europe has Fortune 500 companies. These are very competitive economies, very competitive businesses, and so. But the power of ideology is so strong that Americans tend to think that Europe is socialist, it's strangling and red tape, weak, sclerotic economies. These are all the things that we've been hearing a constant, steady drone about, and so the reality gets outstripped by the ideology and the terrible reporting. Compare, say, for example, public broadcasting in Europe. to the United States. In the United States, the funding for public broadcasting is about $2 to $3 per capita. The BBC gets about $50 per capita. The ARD in Germany gets $60 per capita.
Wow.
They're just getting a lot more money, and so they're a much bigger part of the media landscape in their countries than public broadcasting is here. And so there's just many, many other reasons why the political institutions that we talked at the beginning of the show, where you can have a multi-party democracy. So a Green Party, for example, can not only get out there and have the money and be on TV to get their message across, but they actually get elected into the legislature. So now they can push their ideas. Germany has decided to get rid of nuclear power because of the impact of the Green Party, and it's pushing on that issue for so long. But they've come up with other things, and we haven't really talked about the amazing things that Europe is doing in terms of energy, but they get it takes 40% more fuel to go a mile in an American car than it does in a European car. Americans on average put out twice as much carbon per capita per individual than an average European, and it's because they've redesigned their cars. Their toilets flush less water. They have low wattage light bulbs that are being used in all the buildings, motion sensor lights, so when no one's in a room, the lights go off automatically. Just low-hanging fruit. This is not high-tech stuff, just using existing technology in a very widespread fashion. But in addition, they've moved forward with renewable energy technology.
I've got to stop you there. Let me just say that the thing that strikes me that is the most painful about this, and you don't have time to comment on this because I've got to wrap this up, is that at one point being isolated, the U.S. was protected from wars and so on, and there was some value in it. We had all those resources to exploit and so on. But at this point, that we, in this age of the Internet, in this age of 24-hour global communications, remain so painfully ignorant and arrogant that there are ways that work that are being done in successful countries and successful systems, and that in that whole healthcare debate, there was never a serious consideration of let's look at some other systems. It is, as I said, it seems pathological. So
yeah,
again,
I agree, and it's, of course you expect it from Fox News, but when we on the left and the progressives do that. In fact, in the article I had in The Nation a couple of weeks ago, I said, writers like Naomi Klein and Noam Chomsky, certainly they've contributed great things to our discussion, and yet they don't acknowledge that corporations in Germany and Sweden are different than corporations in the United States.
I've got to stop you. So the book is Europe's Promise, Why the European Way is the Best Hope for an Insecure Age. The website is europespromise.org. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime by linking to the podcast. You can also sign up to have it delivered to you weekly. You can either do that at my website, TerrenceMcNally.net, TERRENCE McNally, MCNALLY.net, or at iTunes. And for podcasts, articles, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to that website. If you want to receive my email announcement weekly telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and giving you some background on these things, you can do that at TerrenceMcNally.net, or you can email me at TEMcNally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com. Thank you, Stephen Hill. Keep up the good work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Very good.